We have Anthony Bly with SDSU, Aaron Daigh with NDSU, and Caley Gesch also with NDSU. Anthony and Aaron are both working with different tillage practices, soil warming and drying out. Caley Gesch is a soil ecologist, so she's really interested in those root interactions with the microbes that are working in the soil, and she has a lot of information collected from the Share Farm projects. So thank you everyone for joining us on this panel, and I think we're just going to dive right in. You know, we hear so much about why you can't reduce tillage in the Red River Valley or this far up north in the Northern Plains, or why it can't be done. And maybe that could apply to anywhere. You hear that often, that it can't be done. But I'd be curious to hear from each of you, having done the research and the on-farm work, as to why can we reduce tillage here? And maybe we'll start with Anthony down in South Dakota as to your thoughts, both as a university individual, but also as a farmer. You use a lot of these practices on your own farm. So let's go right to Anthony.
Yeah, good morning. You know, that's the age-old question that we've heard for many years is, well, I can't do that here. And we hear that, we hear that in regards to other things, other practices as well, just not switching tillage. But for tillage, I kind of shared that sentiment or that thought, 15, 20 years ago. But as we've evolved and we've learned how to do things better, I've witnessed and experienced farmers all across our state in a variety of soil series situations on the flat bottom of the Vermilion River bottom down there in Clay County. That's where that temperature data came from, those high clay soils. It's working there for a farmer that I know quite well there, and it's working for other producers with very, very tough soils to farm. And so in that period of 15 years, I've changed my thoughts on this as well. And I believe, and I know because I've seen it, that these practices will work with about any soil situation. But it takes adherence to the soil health principles, and maybe we can talk about them later. But I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, Anthony. And Aaron, you know, you've been doing some research. You had work on this tile drainage and I think reduced till down in Iowa when you were there before, and now you've brought a lot of that work up here to North Dakota and have plots here. And could you tell us what your research tells you about why these practices can work in the Northern Plains?
Yeah, you know, it's before I answer that one directly, I just want to kind of echo that this is the age-old question. I was born and raised in Arkansas, and then as you just mentioned, Abby, I spent a number of years in Iowa doing research, and now I'm up in North Dakota. And I've heard that same comment on just not tillage, but a number of systems all the way up. Even down in Arkansas, folks say that about, it's like, oh, that's what the folks in Louisiana and down in Mississippi do, you know. It's so we hear this comment kind of everywhere we go. And as I've traveled north and made my way up to here, you know, it's just repeatedly hearing that question, but then seeing, you know, great anecdotes and hearing stories and seeing people's farms of them actually doing it is fantastic evidence in itself. You know, we have research that shows that it can be done and what the constraints are when you change to a new system. And we work to try to figure out how do we get past some of those restraints. But there's plenty of folks around, your neighbors down the road, that are doing it right now and have been doing it for quite some time and quite successfully out there on it. In the research world, one of the things that we've really seen is, you know, with tillage is that back in the day, you know, several decades ago, maybe back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, some of the practices were difficult to do. But it wasn't necessarily because it was the system or the approach, the idea was wrong in itself or wasn't good. It was the technology just hadn't caught up to the concept yet. And what we've started learning is that with the technology, with planters, with the variety of our crops, the genetics in them, they've increased tremendously over the last several decades. And they really allow us to do a lot more and experiment with our lands a lot more and try out systems such as reducing tillage. Because right now, you know, a lot of folks, it's always attractive to try to be the person who yields the most on the farm. or in the neighborhood. But what it really comes down to is the health of the land and whether or not you're being profitable on it. And with our new technologies, we can now start reducing some of our inputs. And one of the easiest ways to reduce inputs these days is reducing a couple passes on the field.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And your work certainly is showing that as far as the response of the soils to these different practices. And I'd like to go to Caley now too, to get her thoughts on the biological part of this. And can the biology, do they respond quickly to reducing tillage? Can they keep up with all the residue on the surface? And what do we know about the biologic component of why we can reduce tillage in this area?
Yeah, well, good morning, everyone. So I just want to echo, what Anthony and Aaron have said. I think, it is a challenge. You're kind of trading off one management system for another. And when we think about how the soil's changing with those transitions, a lot of it does have to do with the type of habitat that the soil provides to all the soil organisms, including plant roots. And so as that video kind of alluded, the soil changes physically, and that just translates to different conditions that might support different types of organisms in the soil. And as the soil starts to change, those habitat characteristics take time, but some soil organisms are very quick to respond. Things like bacteria and fungi can grow quite a bit in a season. The action of plant roots over the course of one growing season can do a lot of good to improve those habitat conditions. And so we start to see that aggregation develop, and weak aggregates start to form within a year. Like you can see them, just by digging in the field. And then the strength of that structure just continues to develop as those soils continue to be managed with less disturbance. And so after 3 to 5 years, we start to see really strong structure developing, lots of pore spaces and aeration. We start to see earthworms migrating back into soils that have been managed under intensive tillage for many years. You start to see roots penetrating deeper and exploring more of the soil because it's easier to root into. And so all of those changes, really, it just, we know there's decades of research that the relationship between tillage and soil quality and soil health. We know so much about how destructive tillage is to soil and the biological aspects. And so all you have to do is just stop or back off a little bit, because the natural tendency of a soil is to develop that beautiful structure and host so much biological activity that can translate to producing a healthier crop. So those changes tend to happen pretty quickly, visibly, and then they just strengthen over time.
That's great. As I'm listening to each of their responses, I can pick each of the research projects that they're talking about as they make those general statements, which number one, I really appreciate that none of you are throwing a bunch of data at us right now, but you're speaking from experience and from the projects and the research that you have experience with and sharing that with us. So Caley, you're kind of alluding to some of these different additional benefits that you might see by using reduced tillage and what that might mean for an operation. And I was kind of curious to maybe go back to Anthony as to some of those additional benefits as to how you're seeing those on your farm, as far as maybe trafficability is maybe an assumption I'm making about that, the soil structure and those aspects before we get to our first question.
Sure, yeah. I'll put on the farmer hat right now. It's not my main job, of course. This is my main job here, but our farm made a decision in 1992 to go full no-till and to be devoted to it. We didn't improve any of our tillage equipment from that point on. In fact, it's still kind of parked in the trees. You just see the structure change almost immediately. Of course, we're in a corn soybean rotation, and there's a debate whether that's an effective rotation for no-till, but I do know farmers that make that work quite successfully. So, and from that point, it just gets better and better. And the fourth and fifth and sixth year were pretty tough on our farm because of the environmental interaction. We had some really high rainfall there in the mid 90s, and it made it very difficult for us. But even then, we were carrying on our fields quite well. The structure had improved to that point. So go down the road now, 28 years, 29 years. It's so much better. This last year, we had nearly 48 inches of rain at our farm. Yes, I didn't get every place planted because of the extreme wetness, but where I did plant, everything carried very well, and I left minimal rutting in the field. The soil is just stronger, and you see that even amplified when we get into a drier situation. It's hard. It's like a road, and farmers, I think, misinterpret that for being too hard to grow a plant, and then they tend to want to rip it up. But that's that strength. That's those bricks. That's those aggregates interlocking and providing a bearing strength, if you will, out in the field. Other things that we noticed was changes in soil biology, especially with the things you can see. The earthworms really increased. And then when I diversified the rotation, made the decision for that on the farm, the night crawlers really advanced all the way across the field in record time, which was really surprising to me. And so we have very, very high infiltration rates. We are getting good air and water exchange. And another note, which is very fascinating, is that our residue disappears very quickly. Our biology is working very well. So for me, that's what makes it all work. The diversification of the rotation and adding the cover crops 7 years ago really set it afire, if that's the right word or not, but really amplified everything that's really good about the system, the soil health system.
Great. That's helpful to hear, not only the research perspective, but then also that you have some of that joint on-farm experience as well. And we got a really great question in the Q&A here. All of you guys have referenced or are working with high clay soils, but how do you make these transitions, or are there better practices to ease into different soil textures or soil types? And maybe we'll go to Aaron for that question, because I know you had some of your research on different soil textures as to the different tillage practices and how they might work, or recommendations you have.
So, it's the texture that you're on will, play a role on what your expectations can be and how quick those expectations might be for them. The thing about clays is that because they're charged surfaces, the clays are what holds on to nutrients in the soil from all the charged surfaces on it. It's also kind of like magnets in the ground, so they stick to each other, they aggregate well. You can see changes in clay soils actually quite quick in a lot of cases. Other soils that are sandy and have a low organic matter to begin with in it, that have very minimal clay or fine particles, it's going to take longer because you don't have the clay there to kind of help the process out. And a lot of times also a little bit of clay, if you have a little bit of clay in your soils and you're working with a loam or a light loam, it's that clay can also help protect some of the organic matter that's accumulating, stick around longer. But if you have essentially you're farming in something that feels like a sand dune, it's going to take a little bit longer because now it's accumulating, the soil health is going to improve at the rate that the organic matter can increase in that soil. So if you change up parts of your rotation or your tillage, that helps increase the amounts of residue that's even being produced and the amount of root systems that are going into that soil, it'll help speed that up. I think I saw Bill Spiegel there in the comments mention about silt loams, and I being that I spent some time in Iowa, when I think of silt loams, I think of the Luss Hills over in western Iowa, where it's almost straight silt over there, hundreds of feet of it. Silts are a little bit different all in their own, because it's not sand, but it's certainly not clay either. It doesn't have the charged surfaces to where it can stick to itself as easy. It holds a lot of water, and silt loams are just innately soft. And so, it's one of the reasons why when we have silt soils, a lot of times they're on hilly landscapes. Those landscapes are the ones that end up having terraces built on them because they erode easily. if they're not protected and have residue laying on the surface to help slow down that water. But then also, it's when you drive over it, if it's a little wet, they're a little less forgiving than clay soils when they're wet because they're just soft. So diversifying a rotation to help the timing of when you're out there driving on those fields can go a long ways. And certainly one thing I highly recommend against is the idea of tilling a silt loam soil for drying it down. Because they hold water and they're soft, it will just smear it over and work backwards on your soil health faster than it will do anything for drying it down.
I'm seeing some biological questions come in here and some things that I'm going to direct towards Caley about, can reducing tillage alone improve structure in a soil or improve the microbial communities enough in 3 to 5 years, or does adding a cover crop help? Could you add compost or manure to speed things up? What are some of the things that you could do to really improve that change of the soils from reducing tillage to make the transition easier?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I mentioned, a soil's natural tendency when it's not disturbed is to allow those microbes and fungi and roots to just help facilitate that aggregation and that building and strengthening of the soil structure. And so certainly if you reduce tillage, that's the first step. That's kind of the most important impact, biggest impact that you can make is reducing the frequency and intensity of tillage. Then, you don't want to leave that soil fallow because plants are the foundation of the soil food web. That material that plants grow out of air and water and nutrients in the soil is what feeds all of the other microbes in the soil, and then other organisms come in and feed on those microbes, and so that's how the system works. And so having growing plants there is really the next most important thing after you reduce your tillage. And the more plants that you can have and the longer that you can have the soil occupied by plants is just going to facilitate that development and all that action of those biological organisms that much faster. And so sure, if you have a diverse rotation, that is better than maybe growing one crop year after year after year. If you can add on some cover crops so that you just reduce the time and the space that experiences fallow, then you're just going to be accelerating the development of those healthy soil properties. So on top of that, then adding some kind of organic matter. One of the best sources of organic matter that you can add is just last year's residue. A lot of the surface residue can, blow away or kind of degrade over time, but those roots, leaving those roots intact and so that they can degrade and feed those soil organisms is, that does a lot of good. If you want to bring in compost or manure, if you have a source for that, and if it fits into the economics of your operation, then that's more food and fuel for all of those good organisms in the soil that are just going to push that recovery forward. And so certainly, as I mentioned, stopping or reducing tillage is the best thing you can do, but then protect the soil and feed it and provide that protection and habitat for the organisms, and they're just going to do their thing, and they're going to do all the work for you, and you'll start to see those benefits over time.
Caley, if I could ask a follow-up to that, maybe we have a really good question about metrics. And so biologically, how are there analysis that we can get to track our metrics, and how do we know this stuff's working biologically? And then maybe after Caley, I'll go to Aaron for more of the physical answer to that.
There are tests. There are commercial tests provided by commercial labs that can tell you how much bacteria you have in your soil, how much fungi, those kinds of things. I use those as in my research all the time. They're very useful tools, but I don't necessarily recommend those kinds of tests for farmers because we can talk about, having confidence in the data and what it takes to actually get a data set that you can make solid conclusions from year to year. Maybe we can talk about that in the cafe talk sessions. But there are commercial tests out there for the things that we can't see, the microbes. But really what I like to have faith in, seeing the earthworms. And if you're seeing aggregates in the development of that structure, if you know that you're protecting the soil, keeping it in place, feeding it with residues and organic matter, you just have to have faith that those microbes are there. And you need to trust us that they are. You don't necessarily need, a commercial test in hand to tell you that. And so if you're seeing, healthy plants that, you're satisfied with the productivity on that field and you see it improve over time, if you look at your soils and start to see the development of that structure, those are all really good indicators of that biological activity. And so when it comes down to testing and monitoring soil health, I'm a big fan of aggregates and spending time in the field just to get to know your soils and watching them change. And then having faith in the practices that you're doing. We know a lot about how organic matter and the reduction of tillage can improve soils. And the data is there. It's been there for decades.
Thank you, Caley. And Aaron, from your perspective, anything to add? If somebody is reducing their tillage, how do they track to see that it's working?
I as a soil physicist, I'm innately interested in how things move. So, and usually that's water. And one of the things, with water on our landscapes is that if you're in an area to where you're worried about excess moisture out in the fields, and so your thought is like, well, if I reduce tillage, is that just going to make even more excess water out there or not? The thing that I look for, or I encourage people to look for, is after rainfall events, or even during a rainfall event, go out and see what it actually looks like afterwards. Are your fields, are they sopping wet and soft? And when you walk out, you come back to the truck with 60 more pounds of mud on your boots than what you went into the field? Or are you coming out and you're like, wow, we got a lot of rain, but it doesn't seem like it out there. One of the things when you reduce tillage is that you preserve macropores that are built either by the soil cracking or by the root systems. Once you give a root system a year or two to kind of start rotting out of some of those pores open up and water moves down. And that's great, because if you get water down deep in the soil profile, it stays there longer for later in the crop season when the plants really need it, to when they're filling grain. That's when they need the most water, is when they're filling grain. And you keep that top of the soil firm, so it holds up equipment when you try to drive over it during your typical operations. So, to me, the best combination is a firm, strong soil that drains really good. That is the magic combination that I look for, because that's preserving those aggregates and managing water well in those situations. And I can tell you this, kind of thinking earlier to what Tim was mentioning with the journey and looking out, seeing what other people are doing and stuff. When I started off in agriculture, I was working with rice systems down in Arkansas. And one of the things in rice systems that you'll hear about is puddling soil. It's intentionally tilling soil when it's wet for the purpose of destroying aggregates. And when it dries, it hardens up, and you can maintain a flood. For rice, that's good. It's a water conservation method when you're doing flood-based rice. When you do it for upland crops, it works the other way. It's very destructive for it. So, and that's one of the reasons why I mentioned earlier, even, tilling for the purpose of drying the soil, you might get a wee bit of drying there, but you're working backwards on your drainage. And so going out after rainfalls and seeing how those fields that ponded, that were muddy for, a week, 2 weeks after a good rainfall, when you change a practice, go out and take a look. See if they're still, muddy, if they're sticking, or if you can actually walk out there now and still have clean boots when you come back to the truck.
So we're talking a little bit too, you're sharing some information on transitioning. And so how long can somebody expect, to stick with that change and see results? And how do they deal with the compaction or ruts that they may have in that transitional period? And maybe let's go to Anthony for this one as to how do you manage that and what can you expect?
Well, first of all, I think it's a commitment and a change of frame of mind. I think you stay committed, but problems will occur. There's no doubt. And so those ruts that we had, just minimally fix those and make it trafficable or make it plantable for the next crop. And if that involves an old wore out disc or when I was up at the dirt conference last year, a well-seasoned producer said, we have a tire drag. And he explained a drag made out of semi tires that they pull behind a tractor and just, go around and just try to work those ruts shut. And I think that was a great answer. And so, yeah, just minimally fix those and make the field trafficable and get on with the next year's crop and make it happen and just stay committed. I see too many producers that have their tillage equipment and they're even maintaining it. And it just makes it so easy to go grab that big disc and, I'm doing part of the field, and then the whole field ends up getting worked, So stay with that commitment and talk to the producers that are and get support from them, and we'll all learn together. That's the approach.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Anthony. We do have several questions still in the queue here, and we're running close to time on this panel. So I'll tell you, we have a question on buying equipment and the economics behind equipment, and then we have another question about why producers might be hesitant. We're going to take those two into our next panel, which is actually a producer panel to talk about those. So don't think that we're ignoring your question there. I do want to end with maybe one more question for Caley, which is, how does residue decomposition change with different practices?
That's a really great question. And that's one of the biggest challenges in this transition period from having a history where you're incorporating the residue and breaking it up and mixing it in with the soil so that you have an easier soil to plant into the following year. That's kind of the conventional system. And then as you're transitioning to a no-till, you tend to have all this surface residue and it causes problems for equipment and stand uniformity and all of that. So those first few years, based on what I've heard from farmers who've experienced this, and I think Anthony alluded to this, is that the first few years, maybe the first 5 years, are challenging. And you kind of might have to get a little creative by incorporating some cover crops to change those carbon to nitrogen ratios so that residue starts to decompose. Or maybe you try strip till as sort of your transition, tool to migrate into a reduced till system. But as that soil begins to recover, as those microbes and fungi and earthworms and insects kind of return to that soil and boost their numbers in response to the lack of disturbance, they're going to take care of that residue over time. And so their ability to reduce that residue and break it down, make it soft, blow it off as CO2, that's all going to improve over time. And it just gets easier and easier the longer that habitat for them is maintained. So they'll help you out. It just takes a little bit of time for that system to get kind of ramped up and cranking.
This was an excellent panel. I know it was very short, but I think it gave us great exposure to the research that's there. The things that I took away from it is that there's been research done on reducing tillage for decades. So the information exists, that it's there to use, but that sometimes the evaluation of whether it's working or not is as simple as walking in the field and getting a shovel in the ground and getting your hands in the soil.